Three, two, one. How we doing, everybody? Welcome. We are here today with Sam Mead Making. How are you doing, man?
Hello, great to be here. Lovely to see you all and lovely to see you. I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. I'm great. I'm real happy to sit down with the Crown King of Mead Talk.
Thank
Like
you.
that's exciting. Got the crown
I
and everything.
I do appreciate it. I was going to go without and be humble, but it was requested, so got to
Yes,
show off the status and all that.
exactly. Absolutely, man. So, for all who do not know, what is mead? Because it may be different. Again, another guest from across the pond. It may be a little bit different there since y'all have more traditional roots and a longer standing history. But America, I know maybe like mead is kind of like the archetypal douchey hipster kind of, oh, I drink mead because I'm classy. So what
Okay.
is mead, for just to explain that to everybody?
So, mead, for those that don't know, is one of the world's oldest alcoholic beverages. And I say one of the oldest because it is a little bit disputed. Whenever I kind of make a video and talk about it being the oldest, I always get someone going, well, you don't really know that. And it is hard to tell. But it's essentially fermented honey. And there's been records of it being made in ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, and even, oh God, what else was it? It just all across history. Oh yeah, Vikings, Scandinavia. That's kind of the one which I think most people associate in pop culture to mead nowadays. But it kind of goes far beyond just that fermented honey. There's loads of different types of mead. So you can put fruit in mead. The Romans made a mead with rose petals called a rhodamel. So in realistic sense, it's kind of like beer, where you've got like ale and lager, and then from that far more derivatives of like IPAs, bitters, pilsner. There's loads of different varieties. So it's a really cool alcohol to get into.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I can even like I don't even know how that could be disputed as like that's not the oldest, because it makes like complete sense. Like it's I know in like making separate wines and fruit alcohols that you put the rind of the plant or of the fruit into the mead because that has the more natural species of yeast that works better for that actual fruit that you're making the alcohol for. So I could easily see somebody putting honey and fruit into water, forgetting about it, and then that making alcohol. I mean,
Yeah, absolutely. I think realistically, the problem is that in nature you can find fermented fruit, and I think the argument is that they would have tribalistic societies would have found these fermented fruits and used that before honey, but the same
yeah.
way that you can actually find fermented honey in the wild as well. But yeah, it's really fantastic. And the Vikings actually used to have these big clay pots or big barrels with these huge like sediments of yeast, which is obviously what metabolizes it into alcohol. And they would just pour whatever they'd pillaged and stolen and raided that year. So that could be fruit, it could even be like meat. That they would put all sorts in there. And most years, I'm going to be honest, it was probably disgusting, but
Oh
it
yeah.
got them drunk, and that's the important
Oh
thing.
yeah, that's all they wanted. I mean, those guys were eating like hero's journeys worth of psychedelic mushrooms before every fight, so I don't think they really cared, honestly. They just wanted to get fucked up.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So besides that, so for I know for beer, wine, especially like whiskeys and bourbons, those take a couple of to the extremes, a couple of decades, and for beers maybe it takes a month or two. How long does it take for just for mead to how long does that take you to make that?
Yeah, so I mean, realistically, it depends on how much honey you put in. So the more honey you put into a mead, the higher the alcohol percentage. And you can get
Mm-hmm.
meads that are as low as beers, so anything from kind of like 3% and lower, all the way up to meads that are 25%. So yeah, exactly, and that's going to give
God
you
damn.
quite the
Woo!
quite the drunk there. But that realistically, it depends on how much honey you use, and also as well, in the last 10 years or so, kind of mead as a science has really taken off. So we've had some new nutrients on the block, like Fermate O. And if you're following good nutrient protocols and using kind of all the bits that you can there, you could make a kind of 14% mead in less than a month.
Less than a month. Okay. So
Hmm.
that's actually really good. Um, so what are the UK's laws on making alcohol? Because and I don't necessarily know if it went to as much of an extreme as it did a constitutional law like it did in the US, but was there ever a time where there was a type of prohibition? Because I know, especially down in the South where it was more prevalent, where we didn't have the mafia and everything running it. Hell, even my grandmother was a moonshine runner, and like making alcohol in your house is like still kind of a pullover from that really taboo era in American history. Is that something that's like kind of can be reflected in British history, or is everybody like, oh yeah, I've got a friend that makes mead? A lot of people I know make mead, or any kind of alcohol at that matter.
I think realistically, so from my understanding of history, there wasn't a prohibition, and I think that's actually hurt the homebrew industry in the UK. You'll find that in the US, mead, for example, is a much bigger thing. There are quite a lot of meaderies. Almost every state will have one. I'm friends with a few people that own various meaderies, and they can't make enough. It just sells out so quick because it's so popular. Whereas in the UK, we only have a few here. Homebrewing as a whole, though, it does exist in the UK, but not as prevalent in the US, I'd say. It is hard, especially because certain supplies are very hard to kind of find and to use, especially when a lot of the kind of creators on like YouTube and TikTok, especially kind of beer and ales and stuff like that, is dominated by American creators. So that makes it really hard for us UK people when we kind of hear about these ingredients that you can't actually get over here. But obviously, when you look at it, the UK has its own variety of things like hops for beer, and then also honey as well. So we have some honeys that some US mead makers would absolutely kill to get their hands on. The main one being that I know of heather honey, Scottish heather honey, which is incredible. I've got a kilo of it downstairs, and it's by far the best thing I've ever tasted in regards to honey. So yeah.
So what's and I wouldn't ask you to run down and get it. You said it was downstairs. I was like, if it was behind you on a shelf, I'd be like, go get it. But what is it? If you just describe what it looks like, is it like one of those dark red bourbon looking honeys that I see, or is it like what's so special about that type of honey?
So it's a honey. So it's called it's a monofloral honey. So it's essentially taken from one type of flower, and that's the Scottish heather
Okay.
blossom. And
Okay, yeah, no,
it's a
that's
kind of a brownie sort of honey. It's a bit darker than your typical kind of like Winnie the Pooh style honey, and it's got this real like quite semi sweetness to it, but a slight smokiness. It's quite
oh
hard to kind of accentuate, but it's a really really delicious honey. And
oh
I'm yet
no,
to
that
kind of
sounds
ferment
fantastic.
it, but yeah, no, absolutely.
Oh yeah, because like and this is another thing, like being down south, like a lot of people, especially with like eggs and stuff, like you'll get the Walmart variety or whatever y'all have as your supermarket variety egg, and it'll be that like kind of pale yellow, but you get a chicken that's out in the yard eating bugs, grass, and whatever it eats, and that yolk is almost like a brown, like it almost looks
Yeah.
like there's something wrong with it, like a deep orange. So and so and I guess that could be said also for just maybe it's the flower, the pollen, or the nectar, whatever is darker makes it that darker. But normally that wild honey, especially with like a mono kind of, well, maybe not for as much for chickens, but definitely for flower. If you get like one flower, that clover honey, or you don't want like a whole bunch of different flowers in your honey. I mean, I know that, and I barely know anything about honey, but I could definitely see how, like, just given off the description you gave, that's something special right there.
Yeah, and I mean, for those in the US that are listening, there is some definitely some US alternatives that you guys have Tupelo honey, which I haven't tried, but I've heard is very highly rated. There are things like cactus honey as well. So yeah,
Cactus
there's
honey.
cactus honey. Yeah, it's incredible what you can see. Like if you look east as well towards Asia, I think they've got like eucalyptus honey and stuff like that. So there's really like there's a world of honeys out there to explore. I hate when people kind of feel like shops are the only places that you can get honey, but like in the supermarket, I imagine you guys have like the bears, right? You guys have like bear honey. It's
Yeah.
in like a yeah. We don't have that here, but it's essentially similar to what we have, which is called Rouse, which is essentially glorified sugar syrup. There's actually not much honey in that. So in
Oh
meat
yeah.
making, we use raw honey, which is essentially pretty much if you were to get a honeycomb, that you've taken out of a hive and scrape off the honey into a jar. It's not processed, it's not filtered. So
Yeah, like I've actually watched a couple of documentaries where they like really go into how like there's like this battle between China and Germany that's one of the main processing and testing centers in the world, where like Germany will come up through this new like testing thing where they scan the honey and filter it, and like here's a specific type of pollen that we can verify is this is actual honey and not some kind of cane or rice syrup. And then China's like, oh, so all we need to do is take 5 pounds of that pollen and mix it into a barrel of honey. And then like It's why, I mean, why can't we just have honey? Like,
It's all
so
about
is there
cost,
like
cost and profit at the end of the day.
it's cost and profit? Is it like that? Because I know we've had like some talk, like I know Bill Gates a couple years back was talking about, guys, the bees are dying off, and everybody was kind of panicking. So, and then now I'm being told that that was kind of a hyperbolic kind of situation where bees aren't really as important as pollinators as we thought, that a lot of just normal bugs that hop from flowers to flowers, not necessarily taking the pollen intentionally, but just like bugs doing random stuff. So has that the hyperbolicness of that situation of the threat of losing bees and honey, did that affect the price of honey and possibly why they were making these cheaper alternatives?
It definitely, I feel, has impacted it. But I mean, on that note, it is true that there are other pollinators, but without bees, there's no honey and there's no mead, which is why I actually, I have quite a few businesses that I'm working on in kind of the mead industry. A few of those I can't quite talk about yet, but all of those, I'm going to be donating a portion of the profits to a bee conservation trust in the UK, because there is a lot of problems with bees, bee habitats. There's a lot of parasites that are absolutely tearing their way across the, both here and in the States. So it is worrying. It might not be the case where it's like we need to do, they're going to die right this second. But bee populations are collapsing, and that is a real concern.
Yes.
And if you enjoy honey in any form, even shop honey will go up in price if bees were to get even more endangered than they are already. So it's really important in my opinion. But with regards to kind of like the price of honey, I've actually surprisingly enough, I've only been making mead for around a year. I only tried mead for the first time last year. So
Wow.
I have kind of come onto the scene very quick and very hot and heavy, but I've been very fortunate to be taught by some of the best people in the industry in the US and in the UK as well. There's a great network of people in the kind of mead industry that all kind of talk, and it's the best way to collaborate with these sorts of things. So I've been very, very blessed.
Oh, so you had that. It's like, I can't get enough of this. I have to do this.
Yeah, and I mean, at the time of recording, the UK is still in full national lockdown, so we can only leave our houses to go to the shops, and also to do essential things like school if you're if you're the child of a key worker, or work if you can't work from home. And that was the same last year when I kind of got into mead making, and that's why I started. It was out of boredom and frustration, and well, if I'm going to be stuck at home for a year, might as well make some good alcohol to enjoy it. And I made the first few batches, and then I was like, wow, this is really fun. And then a few months ago, October time, I started my TikTok, and I thought, you know what, I want to show the world this. No one else on TikTok is making mead, and that's what I want to do. I want to show people how to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even myself, like this podcast, it wasn't necessarily because I am in lockdown, because honestly, Alabama's like, wear a mask, stay 6 feet away, and if a business isn't closed, y'all can kind of do whatever you want. And that's probably why we have such numbers like we do. But besides that point, my thing with starting this podcast is like, we've got like 1 million people losing their jobs or quitting their jobs because they feel unsafe a week. That's, I mean, so, and on top of what I hear of automation, I'm like, I need to find something else to do, like to even think about making money, even if it's like 4 or 5 different things. So I completely understand where you're coming from, where you just need like a different kind of a different gig to get you going somewhere.
Yeah, and I think kind of the last year or so, as much as obviously it's been very unfortunate that there's such high levels of unemployedness in both the US and the UK and around the globe. I think it's really helped people like myself and yourself that have thought about, I've got a passion for like entrepreneurship and enterprise, and
Absolutely.
I didn't begin making mead to make money, because realistically, I've spent way more than I probably will make for many years. I got into it because I really liked it, and I kind of thought about it, and it's a really underappreciated market. And in the UK, there are some really great meaderies, but also there are some really not great ones that are actually selling really well. And you think, well, if these guys that make stuff that tastes pretty subpar are managing to, grow and stuff like that, you think, well, what could I do if I actually go away and really get into the science and the minutiae of it? So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the same could be said about how, especially people in Europe and Britain and maybe even German look at like American beers, like a Natty Light or a Bud Light. Like it's all for. I've heard a lot of people in Europe talk about how they must just pump that stuff just as quick as possible. How where y'all even your non like pitch black beers or stouts or whatever you call them, uh, like even your other kind of on par light beers are like drastically better in every way, shape, or form. Is that just something that people are like, hey, this is a brand that it's always going to be there? It's not necessarily specialized, so it's cheap. And so, do you think it's like a bunch of those factors playing into it, or is it just like those
Yeah.
people care so much that everything has to be perfect, so it's not that readily accessible to the population?
Yeah, I mean that's quite a lot to unpack. But when it comes to things like beer in particular, so I mean, to be upfront, I actually don't really drink beer. I don't really like it. I always try it when people suggest beers to me.
Yeah.
But I'm yet to find a beer I really enjoy. But I'm friends with some TikTokers that make beer in the US, and from my understanding, American kind of beers were inspired heavily from like German and Belgian ales. And Belgian beers. And essentially now the UK is now mirroring that. So in the last few years, we've had a bit of a craft boom, craft beer boom. Outside of lockdown, you find that everywhere, every city in the UK will probably have 4 or 5 microbreweries that are all kind of chugging out their beer. And part of the reason why we've seen a huge resurgence of that is that smaller beer breweries actually have a tax cut on their beer duty. So in the UK, per hectoliter of any kind of alcohol, you have to pay a certain amount to the government on top of tax. And the smaller companies get quite a heavy reduction of up to 50%, which really means that they can come
Wow.
in at quite an aggressive price point compared to the bigger breweries that have, connections to thousands of pubs across the UK. So that's really where we've seen the craft beer boom. And I'm going to be honest, I really can foresee a similar thing with mead, especially, kind of the early 2000s and 10s really laid the brickwork. So things like Game of Thrones, and games like even Assassin's Creed that's come out recently, Valhalla, they are kind of bringing mead back into the public psyche. And I feel like there's a real demand there. It's an untapped market, and it's something that in the next 5 or 6 years in the UK, I think it's absolutely going to boom. And I want to help, put it the right foot forward, because obviously with kind of burgeoning industry, if it's a company at the front that just kind of wants to maximize their profits and don't really care about flavor, then you're going to find that the industry as a whole kind of gets simmered down because there's not that competitive flavor, to competitiveness in that instance. Sorry. And I want to make sure that it's flavor that we're on about, and we're on about making something that people around the country are going to see value in picking up and enjoying. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's kind of fascinating how you're talking about those microbreweries getting like a 50% tax countdown. I know nothing about taxes, but I can say with almost solid confidence that America don't do that. Like the big companies get the tax breaks, so there's not really that kind of incentive here. But I mean, that's incredible, especially with alcohol, because around here, like alcohol, like they don't even charge you. They charge you taxes if you drink it. So like if you make the alcohol and like you give it to a friend and that friend drinks it, technically you're supposed to pay taxes on that alcohol, even if it was like freely given. So we just got some weird laws.
Yeah,
And
that's
probably
crazy. That's crazy. We're
yeah,
allowed to
it's
gift, but
wild.
we're not allowed to sell without kind of. I think you need at least 2 licenses in the UK. You need a personal license and a professional license, and I think for beer as well, you need to sign up to an organization. So there is a lot of red tape, and in the UK, I think we've got the highest beer duty in the world. So there is, you can see why a lot of these industries are struggling. And when it comes to mead as well, without getting into the nitty gritty, our mead hasn't got a tax as such. It comes under a really wide umbrella called made wine, which is essentially everything aside from wine that's made with grapes. And
Okay.
it's a lot of meaderies in the UK are campaigning that these kind of costs are really high, because the cost of honey compared to things like hops and grapes is way higher. It's
Oh yeah.
honey is not cheap, and
No.
obviously to be able to actually afford to upkeep, because a lot of the equipment is very expensive to buy, and there is a lot that goes, a lot of time and effort that goes into making mead. It's really hard to price it at a point where you aren't just kind of selling at a loss, essentially. So there is a very big debate with taxes in the UK.
No. Wow. Even at the 50% threshold.
So in the UK, like that's only for beers. Meaderies don't get them. So I'm kind of talking
Okay.
specifically
Okay.
about mead, like up and coming meaderies like myself. I'm hoping I actually am not selling my mead yet. I'm in the process of kind of perfecting a recipe, but I'm hoping to be kind of launching by kind of June, July time. So
Oh, okay. Okay, that makes a lot more sense. Speaking on your making your mead, what's the process of making mead like?
yeah, so compared to kind of beer, it's a quite a lot simpler. So you don't need to boil unless you're making certain types of mead, but a standard mead, which is just essentially honey, water, and yeast, is called a traditional. And essentially, it's a case of making sure that everything's clean. You use sterilizing either powder or solution. Like in the US, you guys have Starsan. In the UK, we use Chemsan, but there's powders as well. That's kind of the biggest thing that takes a lot of time, making sure that everything's clean. But then realistically, you get a bucket or you get a carboy. We call them demijohns, which are kind of the glass or plastic, kind of containers. You chuck in your honey, you chuck in your water, you add your yeast, and then if you're kind of doing things the modern and kind of more proper way, you use various nutrients, and then you just let it run. That's it. It's quite simple. It's realistically a lot of it is more as well kind of the maths. So where you're kind of if you're a newer kind of mead maker and you're not too fussed about kind of getting that kind of accuracy, you might just go, right, I'm going to chuck 3 pounds of honey into this carboy and top it up with water. But obviously where I'm kind of like, right, I need to make a consistent product. It comes down to me kind of working out really particular maths of, right, this much honey takes up this much volume, and then on top of that this much water, and then you have to then reverse engineer some of the kind of nutritional figures. It sounds a lot scarier than it is. So I actually have a YouTube channel called SamMakingMead, and I break down mead making into 6 core concepts in a series called The Basics. The series takes less than half an hour to watch, and it kind of preps you for your first mead. So it's not as scary as it sounds.
Absolutely. And we'll be sure to link that YouTube channel and possibly the video series down in the description of this video.
Well, thank
But
you.
so I know about what is it? It's the gravity of the mead where you have like this tall silhouette vessel and you drop like this gravity weigher. What does that indicate as far as mead making?
So what you're talking about there is called a hydrometer, and that's what is used in beer, wine, and cider and mead as well. And essentially, what a hydrometer measures is it measures the viscosity of a fluid. So it allows you to kind of tell the sugar content because sugar weighs more than water. So the way it would work is you take your initial gravity reading, and the way that gravity is done is quite hard to explain, but it's essentially a number that's 1 point and then you get 3 digits after that. And gravity starts off higher and then ends lower. So for instance, if a mead were to start at 1.050, it would finish off at 1.000 or thereabouts, because 1.000 is a dry mead, and that's essentially what water is. So if you were to pop a hydrometer into a cylinder of water, it would be 1.000. So that essentially means there's no excess sugar, and it is just alcohol that has been left. And that's why then afterwards we then add, we re-add the honey by a process called back sweetening.
Okay, so the sugar's heavier, or the sugar in the honey is heavier than the water. Now, does it go up or down when the sugar is transformed into alcohol, or
Down.
is alcohol down? So the
Yeah.
alcohol is lighter or the same as water?
Yeah, so it starts off at a higher gravity and then it goes down to that standard 1.000 or thereabouts.
So you would be able to tell by the difference of, let's say it's maybe at a 2 or a 3. I don't really know if those are realistic numbers or not, and how you would estimate that it would go down back to that standard base level. You could then tell the percentage of the alcohol that the fluid would hold.
Absolutely, absolutely. So there is an equation. I have one of the videos on the basic series is all about hydrometers, and I teach you how to read them. And part of that is the equation. So there is a great website called Brewer's Friend, which is the Brewer's Friend ABV calculator, and you just punch in your original gravity, or OG, which is the gravity that you measure on day 0 when you're making your mead, and then the final gravity, which you measure on the day that you're actually bottling the mead, and it will take those two and run it through a kind of little equation, and out it will pop with your ABV.
That's fantastic. So you said normally mead goes from 25 to 3%. is there anything that's especially like special about that, or is that just up to the person's preference, or is there like because I know some meads were or some alcohols at least they would have more of a mixture where they would have the heavier alcohol like you would have a Chardonnay with your champagne and orange juice. So is that really heavy in mead culture, or do they just like throw that shit back at 25%?
It's realistically dependent on what you're trying to achieve. So for a newer mead maker, I would suggest making a mead between 10 and 14%, because when you go below that, you find that firstly, there's a higher risk of infection because the alcohol, after you kind of reach that 9-10% mark, kind of acts as a bit of an antimicrobial barrier, which makes it a
Yeah.
bit easier because you are going to make little mistakes. But then when you kind of go above that 14%, what you'll find is that you get a lot more, the yeast need a lot more help. So you need to have a lot more better temperature control, really good kind of nutrition down to make sure that your yeast are happy. Otherwise, they aren't going to thrive. They aren't going to make the alcohol. One thing that you'll find is that with lower ABV mead, so kind of that below that 10% mark, they kind of have more of a kind of mouth feel, that kind of, that consistency of beer. And then as you get higher up, you can make it like a white wine where it kind of feels like that watery sort of feel. Some people like that. But we can add extra elements, like, for instance, using oak to kind of increase that mouthfeel and have it feel more like a port. So it's completely customizable, completely customizable.
Yeah, and speaking of the temperature control, I think I saw in a recent video of yours where you actually had refrigerators with a heating element put inside of the refrigerator, and it was temperature controlled. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so that's something that I saw online from a company called the Malt Miller. And essentially, what we're trying to do is we're trying to keep the yeast at a certain temperature. So if yeast are too cold, what's going to happen is they're going to stop fermenting and even fall out of the solution. And obviously, that's what we call a stall. And that's not ideal because you're going to add time to your fermentation. And then if you ferment too hot, what you're going to find is that the yeast are going to start to produce something called fusels, which is essentially bad alcohols. It's where you can kind of get that taste of kind of like farts or, those kind of nastier hot things, like when you kind of, drink a whiskey for the first time and you get that kind of burning sensation in your throat. So it's all about every yeast has an ideal temperature range, the same way that we as humans, we all have ideal kind of temperatures that keep us happy. And the way that works is you have a fridge, you have a heating element, and then you use something called Inkbird, which you guys I think have over in the US as well. And that essentially kind of acts as a controller. So you plug the fridge and the heating element into the Inkbird, and then on the Inkbird you set the temperature. So at the moment I've got a mead that's at 18 degrees Celsius. Sorry, I know you guys use Fahrenheit. Sorry, but it'll essentially then toggle the fridge on and the heater on to keep it at that level. So if it gets too hot, it'll turn the fridge on for a little while. And then when it gets down to that temperature again, it will turn the fridge off. And if it gets too cold, it will turn the heater on. And essentially it's a balancing act. And it will, I believe there are settings as well to make sure that it's not toggling a fridge on and off like thousands of times a second and causing a fire or anything like that. So it's all very safe.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, as far as the temperature and the yeast you were talking about, what is yeast necessarily? Like, I know it's what it's used for, but what is it? Is it a microbial? Is it a fungi? What is yeast exactly?
So yeast is a bacteria that you'll find in all walks of life, and essentially we've harnessed them as a species to turn. We use it for quite a lot of things, but obviously in the alcohol world we use it to turn excess sugars, whether that be in wine, your grape juice, or in beer, you get your hop. Into alcohol, so it's metabolizing it. And then obviously we used yeast also. Use yeast also in things like bread making to help because they produce CO2 to help make bread rise. So there's a number of applications, and yeast isn't kind of like a be all and end all. The same way that humans from different parts of the planet look different and do have different abilities. It's the same with yeast. So we've developed yeast that are designed to be used for bread yeast. For bread making, so bread yeast. And then also you have a variety of yeasts for things like beers, ales, wine yeast, even mead yeasts are coming around. But what tends to happen is we tend to use champagne or wine yeast to make a mead because that kind of gives a good flavor profile.
Okay. Now, I know that like watching a lot of shows. I mean, there's an anime called Doctor Stone where they try to make alcohol for different scientific purposes. But I remember there was this one part of the episode where they were talking about where one of the jugs were turned into vinegar. Is that something that happens in making alcohol? Is that just that's a like a wild strain of yeast that infects it if you don't sanitize it properly?
So that is definitely one of the ways it can happen. Vinegar is made from something called an Acetobacter bacteria, and it's essentially like another form of yeast. And you'll find that the way that they get into most meads or alcohols is when you mix it. So it's really interesting with mead because at the beginning we want to add a load of oxygen. Where you'll see in a lot of my videos, I have like a bit that attaches to a drill, and you really mix it up because you want to homogenize the honey with the water, but also we want to imbue that kind of solution with oxygen because yeast are living things as well. They need oxygen. However, later on, once the yeast have begun that process of fermenting that sugar into alcohol, we actually don't want to add oxygen, which is why in mead making you'll see loads of airlocks, which are kind of the weird plasticky things where you see the bubbles popping up. And that's essentially because we don't want to add anything from the outside, and that includes oxygen. And what you'll find is that the Acetobacter, bacteria are in the air. And if you were to, for instance, day 10 after you started your mead, get it out and really slosh it around, there's a real good chance that that may end up becoming vinegar. And some people do that on purpose. It can add a sourness, and some people even make mead vinegar. But for most people, obviously, it's not really a desired taste. But luckily in mead making, once you kind of get that past that 9%, as I was saying earlier, you kind of stop that bacteria growth from being able to happen, which is, again, why I suggest newer mead makers to kind of aim for that 10 to 14%, because there'd be nothing worse than getting to the point of bottling, making a few mistakes. You add a little bit too much air to your mixture as you're kind of adding it to the bottle, and then you end up with vinegar in a week's time. So,
oh wow, that's fantastic. That's definitely something I could see with one of the newer mead makers where they're like really excited. They don't really know how the process works. I know even myself with a bunch of different ventures like reselling online, I'll see myself just on like eBay like 4 or 5 times a day, like did something sell, so I could see somebody opening up their meads like, hey, is it working? Maybe it's not aerated enough, I'll spin it up again, and then they would introduce that bacteria, and then it would kind of ruin the mead making process and get vinegar.
yeah, so when I made my first mead, I was very anxious, and I actually, I've got my bed down here, and I had a bucket, and I had it next to my bed so I could hear it bubbling when I was asleep, and I would check it way too often. Luckily,
Nice.
nothing went wrong, but yeah, newer mead makers, it is an exciting process, and it really does teach you patience, because most things that we do in life is instant gratification. Even
Yeah,
baking or cooking, a day might be like it'd be crazy to make a recipe that takes all day in cooking, but alcohol takes
absolutely.
longer. So it's that process of it's kind of philosophical in teaching you kind of delayed gratification, and it's an experience thing. Once you've done it a few times, you learn that you don't need to constantly check on it, and there are certain times that you might need to, we take gravity readings throughout to ensure that fermentation's okay, but aside from that, we leave it closed. Towards the end, I might start taste testing it every few days just to see kind of what flavor profile we're looking at. But yeah, it's a very easy mistake to make, and there are quite a lot of mistakes you can make. Again, I don't want to make me making sound scary, but that's again what I kind of do. So on TikTok, I do kind of a whole series about easy mead mistakes that you can make and how to avoid them. And one of them is very much shaking your mead after kind of the first. I'd say after day 0, it's not needed. Other mead makers will disagree, and you'll find that mead as a whole is quite a contentious community, more so than wine and beer. And you'll find that there are kind of these camps of people that have very virulent kind of images as to what mead making should be, all the way from the traditional, well, I don't want to add anything unless it's honey, water, or yeast, to people like myself that I kind of, these things that are made, like the nutrients, a lot of them are actually natural anyway, and they're, following the science rather than tradition, but to each their own.
Yeah, no, I can hear that. Like, I mean, that's almost a camp in almost anything. Like, even some car people nowadays are like, if it needs to be a gas engine, it needs to have this, no chips, no electronics, no computer adjusted air intakes. And then you've got some people's like, hey man, if a Tesla can outrun a Porsche, then I'm gonna take the Tesla.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's what it's all about. And I think it's finding a balance between education and experimentation. So I kind of try to teach people the core things that you really shouldn't do wrong. Things like, like you said, like, mixing it after 6 or 7 days, but you can experiment. As you said at the beginning of the show, using wild yeast. So yeast that you may find in honey or yeast that you may find on, plants. So I know that it's quite common, I think, to do elderflower mead, where you actually use the wild yeast from the elderflower and you don't sanitize it or anything. You just chuck it in there. And you can end up with some really interesting flavor profiles because each yeast is going to treat that alcohol differently and create different end products. So it's all about experimenting, try out new things, but learn the basics. That's kind of what I would say for anyone.
Yeah, because even with what it's called, like even with the traditionalist, like there's like, because do you believe that gives you an advantage of being so science centric, where this is a nutrient that does this to the mead and this is a special breed of yeast, to where you may have a more traditionalist, maybe even a far traditionalist, where they're like, we take natural yeast from this species of flower or this plant, we chunk it in there, and then this one's really good but the other ones are kind of subpar. Do you think there needs to be a kind of, and I'm trying to make this a multifaceted question and not trying not to, but do you think it's important to kind of meet in the middle on those aspects, to where if you get too scientific, you kind of take away the soul of the mead, as it were? Or do you think it just, no, science is progress, and for things to progress, they need to progress?
I think a lot of the time, education provides real interesting insight. So I recently did a video all about nutrition because it's one of the biggest hurdles that mead makers do. They go, I don't want to add any white powders because nutrients come in kind of, powdered bags. And one of the first things that I say in the video is, the Vikings actually used nutrients and they just didn't know it. So in older mead making, as I was saying at the beginning, they'd have these big clay pots and these big thick yeast cakes. And in those yeast cakes or sediment, entire ecosystems of yeast would live, and yeast would be born and they would expire. And expired yeast actually feed newer yeast. They cannibalize themselves. And quite a lot of the nutrients that we see on the market today, the main ones being GoFerm and Fermaid O, are actually autolyzed yeast. So essentially, it's a process where they take the completely naturally made yeast and they kind of boil it down to the core minerals and nutrients that are going to benefit the yeast. So from that standpoint, if you were to kind of tell someone that, realistically, they're not adding anything unnatural to your meat.
Yeah.
And instantly people might go, oh, that actually makes sense. And I'm going to be honest, without getting too sciencey, stigma around kind of using inorganic things such as stabilizers, which are chemicals, which are common preservatives, like you'll find in Pepsi, potassium sorbate. That's one of the things we use to kind of kill off the yeast at the end of fermentation in more modern mead standards. You'll find that those things, they don't really change the flavor if you dose it correctly. And again, ultimately, it comes down to experimentation. Anyone that's starting out, I'd say, learn the scientific way first, and then experiment with the traditional, and then compare your results. Because ultimately, in my opinion, it's not really about the process, it's about how the mead tastes at the end. If your mead tastes better, then I need to listen and I need to take notes. And I'm always happy to learn. So...
yeah, absolutely. And I even today, like, I know like a lot of people are like processed foods and all that. Like you've got like food, like you got a can of green beans with a couple of chemical additives you can't pronounce. So even with the nutrients, how you said they are actually completely natural, they're just more or less processed, not by chemical means, but by kind of boiling it down and extracting and burning off older materials and like extracting that kind of core mineral that they would eat anyway. They just don't have to get, they don't like, they get rid of the shell to get the pecan.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. And you'll find, if I were to write down on a piece of paper all of the chemical compounds that make up things like oranges and bananas, and if I were to like advertise it, it's just that list of chemicals, people would be like, that's disgusting. That is just, that's just processed things. The world is made up of complex chemical structures that we've found scientific names for the sake of brevity. And it's the exact same with mead making. They may sound scary, GoFerm, Fermaid O, but they are just nutrients. They are things that are going to help the yeast thrive. Because if we look at things like honey, honey and water by itself are actually very nutritionally sparse. And that's one of the reasons why we actually have very strong evidence of Egyptians making mead, because even after thousands of years, we found in clay pots residue of honey that hasn't been, you'd expect if you were, for instance, put a chocolate bar outside, within a few days, that would be completely gone because that would be destroyed by bacteria, by animals, by fungus. Honey has such a high sugar content, usually around 80% of its mass is pure sugar, that actually bacteria can't survive on it and they can't eat it because it's too dense. And that's
they almost
why
drown in it.
Yeah, and that's exactly why in mead making, when we add the honey and the water together, the water does add some nutrients, but we need to supplement it. So in things like beer making, hops and things like that have a lot of natural nutrition in them, so it's not a bigger thing. But in in mead and wine to a lesser extent, it's very important to look at nutrition.
Yeah, that's good. So tell everybody what your business is, more or less. I know you said you haven't really started the process of really selling it. I've seen you've got a couple of stickers and bottle labels. So tell everybody where you're at currently in your business, what it kind of took you to get there, and where do you kind of want to go with all this?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So where I'm at currently is I'm at a state of trying to kind of triangulate a recipe. So I don't really want to launch with a half-baked product. So I am doing quite a scientific method of batch testing. So at the moment, downstairs in my fridges, I have 4 mead varieties that have one single variable changed, whether that be a yeast or a type of nutrient schedule I'm using. And essentially what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be I've put out a survey and I've acquired up to 20 names, and I've got some information on their taste palette. And what I've tried to do is I've tried to get a mixture of people that enjoy beer, cider, wine, and mead. And I want to eventually, so the plan is to send out the mead to them in a blind taste test, just numbered bottles, and get feedback on their taste, smell, and things like that. And then I'm going to, from there, take the best one and do another batch and essentially rinse and repeat that process until I have a product that all of the wine, beer, cider, and mead drinkers can go, that tastes good. And realistically, what I'm planning on launching in the market is I want to have a mead that someone can take a single sip of and go, okay, that is what mead is supposed to taste like. It's what it's supposed to look like. It's what it's supposed to smell like. So I'm planning on launching with a very classical recipe, and I'll be excited to kind of share that as we get closer. But I'm essentially going to be building a micro meadery in my back garden. So I'm actually building a work shed on a concrete base, and I'm going to be using those fridges to kind of start production. So I've got some more commercial equipment I'm awaiting on. And then the plan there realistically is just to scale up, and experiment with different recipes, seasonal things. I've got some great plans for Christmas this year, hopefully. Where it comes to alcohol with regards to selling at the moment, inside the UK isn't too bad, but we've just finished the Brexit transition period, and the legislation around kind of trade deals is really up in the air. So it is really hard to work out exporting at the moment. I was speaking to a mead friend of mine who's setting up his own meadery in the UK, and apparently you need to have 3 customs sheets when sending a package outside of the UK. And it's like that level of paperwork per order makes it unfeasible because you'll be looking at 2 hours of paperwork per bottle of mead. So
you'd have to order a gallon at that point for even to make sense.
Yeah. So at the moment, I'm planning a UK-wide launch, and I will be hoping to start in the EU and eventually even maybe export or, get someone to set a SamMakingMead meadery up in the US. But that's kind of the process we're looking at. And with regards to the equipment, I'm starting very humbly. So people that are thinking about starting their own meadery, you don't have to start with this huge, big steel fermenters. I'm planning on getting there, but at the start, I'm just going to be using these fridges. I'm going to be getting I'm going to be starting with 2 60-liter buckets. And then once fermentation is done, I'm going to be transferring them into a food-safe steel drum, using that to age, and then I'll be filtering and bottling when it's kind of, the flavor profile's ready, and I've got some other bits that I'm going to be adding as well. So that's kind of what that looks like. And I've got another project which isn't necessarily about me selling bottles of mead, but I'll be very excited to share that. Maybe even I could come back on in a year's time and we could have a catch up about how you've been, how I've been, and you know, I'd love to kind of give an update because this year I've got some really great projects I'm working on, and I'm hoping by the end of the year I'm going to have some really exciting stuff to talk about.
Oh no, absolutely, dude. I can't wait to have you back on. And I was even like asking, it's like seeing if I could actually get like a sample, but I don't want to pest you with that 2 hours worth of paperwork for what might not even account to like half a bottle or something.
Yeah, absolutely. In the sending actual alcohol to the US is actually really hard to do, so I'd need to use an exporter. But when I get around to eventually exporting to the US, I absolutely will be letting you know when that's available, and I'll be hooking you up with a bottle. So don't you worry.
All right, definitely, man. I can't wait to do it. Well, everybody, thank you so much for coming on, and Sam, thank you so much for coming on, man. I know you're a busy dude, and it's probably nighttime where you're at. So
Yeah, it's around about 7 p.m. now, so I'm gonna go have some
Woo.
dinner and you know, crack on with the rest of my evening. But it's been really great. Thank you so much for your time, and thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So tell everybody where they can reach you at socials and all.
Yes, so you guys can find me on Sam Making Mead on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and I also have a Discord. You'll be able to find all of my links on my TikTok, so Sam Making Mead, and I post on TikTok 3 times a day, YouTube whenever I get a chance to, and yeah, that's kind of pretty much all from me.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Thank y'all so much for watching another episode. Please remember to subscribe to both Sam and Mai's channels. We'll go ahead and be sure to bring you more content on both of them, and I will see you definitely back in maybe a year's time or so.
Absolutely. I look forward to it. See you guys then.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Peace.